from traffic violations to murder. Any immigrant who is in the U.S. illegally and is charged, convicted, or even suspected of an offense is considered an enforcement priority under President Trump's new immigration rules.
Those people who are in this country and pose a threat to our public safety or have committed a crime will be the first to go.
Supporters are applauding the decision.
It is about time. The new guidelines don't actually change any existing laws.
But the immigrant community and its advocates are denouncing it.
Breaking up families and deporting immigrants is not going to solve any of those problems.
When Trump won the election in November, hundreds of universities, cities, and churches joined the sanctuary movement, offering asylum to undocumented immigrants. But a recent poll shows a majority of Americans stand behind President Trump's decision to crack down on sanctuary cities. According to the Harvard-Harris poll published in The Hill, 80% of voters say local authorities should have to comply with the law by reporting to federal agents the illegal immigrants they come in contact with. President Trump is also speaking out about a string of threats to Jewish community centers around the country over the last few months.
The anti-Semitic threats targeting our Jewish community and community centers are horrible and are painful, and a very sad reminder of the work that still must be done to root out hate and prejudice and evil.
Trump's comments made at the newly opened National Museum of African American History and Culture marked the first time he's directly addressed the threats against American Jews. Critics call the president's comments too little, too late. Meanwhile, Congress is also facing criticism, and it's coming from both sides of the aisle. One major problem, agreeing on a way to repeal and replace Obamacare. The New York Times recently reported, quote, efforts to come up with a replacement for the health care law have been stymied by disagreements among Republicans about how to proceed. The same is true for a proposed overhaul of the tax code. And Democrats are taking their protests against the plans on Obamacare, immigration, and other issues to Republican lawmakers in their local town hall meetings.
No ban, no walls. America has room for all. No retreat.
President Trump tweeted that the numerous protests were planned out by liberal activists. Many protesters say they're simply grassroots opponents of the president's agenda. But liberal activists have posted plans online for how to stage protests and make their voices heard at congressional meetings. Still, in Washington, President Trump is making it clear that he's planning to move ahead with his agenda on issues like Obamacare, the economy, immigration, and more. And he'll have to be working with Congress to make it happen. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
Well, thanks, Caitlin. Our CBN News political correspondent David Brody is with us now from Washington. Brody, David, how does the Trump administration look at these last few weeks, the 100 days and so forth? Are they optimistic? Do they feel it's a success, or are they frustrated?
Well, they're frustrated with the media coverage for sure, Pat. But beyond that, they think things are going actually pretty well. Now, look, I mean, you mentioned at the top of the broadcast, Pat, he's taken on some pretty heady stuff here, some very controversial issues as it relates to this travel ban or temporary travel ban, and now this immigration order. But look, the White House believes that they've got to get things done quickly, and the best way to do that on the immigration front, at least, and on the travel ban front, is to go through with executive orders, because it's not going to necessarily have to go through Congress. And so that's why they've rolled this out first. Now, as it relates to health care and tax reform and all of the heavy lift that has to go through Congress, that's where the rubber meets the road, and that's where they've got to get moving on some of that stuff, or they may lose control of the narrative here, Pat.
Well, the narrative right now, of course, the New York Times is doing everything they can to make him look bad, but are the Republicans fighting over these issues? Is there consensus from what you found on the Hill?
There is not consensus. There's not consensus on replacing, actually the plan to replace Obamacare. And there's not necessarily consensus on tax reform right now. Now, having said that, there's a meeting later this afternoon at the White House, the legislative team meeting inside the White House about these three specific things: Obamacare, tax reform, and the budget. Those will all be rolled out. Remember, the president's going to speak to a joint session of Congress Tuesday of next week, where we expect to hear more details on this. We're told Obamacare, or at least the plan to replace Obamacare, will come in mid-March. Donald Trump actually saying he wants tax reform, a bill signed by the end of the year. Now, Pat, we've talked on this program before how they were hoping tax reform would be a bill that he could sign into law sometime in maybe the spring, late spring. I don't think that's happening now. I think it's going to be much later than that.
What's the sticking point on the repeal of Obamacare? What is the thing that it seems like there's a universal feeling among Republicans that thing needs to go, but what's the holdup?
Well, I think the holdup is how much of it do you replace, whether it be all at one time. You know, you've got the Rand Paul crowd, the Ted Cruz crowd who says, you know, get rid of the whole thing. And then you've got more of that establishment Republican crowd that says, hey, look, let's piecemeal this thing and go bit by bit. And so I think the concern in the Republican circles on Capitol Hill is if you're going to go ahead and get rid of the whole enchilada, you may have a bigger mess potentially later on down the road. And so I think there's some political calculation involved here, Pat.
We know the Democrats have done everything to frustrate the appointment of the cabinet. It's just shocking what they've done. Is Mitch McConnell ready to jam those next appointments through and stop this back and forth?
The sense is that the frustration is wearing thin for sure. Now, whether or not McConnell, who, as you know, Pat, is a student of the Senate and a guy that likes to play by the procedural rules, at least for the time being, he'd be reluctant to do that right away. Now, having said that, there are 7 or 8, I believe, still cabinet members not confirmed. Rick Perry at Agriculture, quite a few others. And so there is a growing sense of frustration that the president's not getting these cabinet members through. But once again, remember, Democrats, as you know, changed those rules back in 2013 to get those cabinet members through on a majority vote. So eventually they'll get there. But really, if you think about the crown jewel of all of this for the Trump administration in the first 100 days has been the Neil Gorsuch pick for the Supreme Court. It's gone over very well, and it looks like that's smooth sailing up there on that front.
Well, he's bringing out a new executive order. I talked to Jay Sekulow about what's going to be in that. Jay thinks he can pass muster, but my goodness, to go back to that circuit out in California, it's just the Ninth Circuit is just, a terrible danger because they'll probably go against it. Then you've got a split cord. So it's a very risky thing he's doing right now.
Well, what the White House wants to do is go dual track. In essence, they are not going to rescind the original executive order that was stopped by the Ninth Circuit. So in other words, that will go forward. What they'll do is they believe they can argue that case, that executive order, on the merits. It'll go back to Washington State, and they'll deal with that on one track. And then the other track will be this new executive order coming that is supposed to be tailored a little bit more specifically. It'll still include those 7 terror-prone countries. And by the way, Pat, I said terror-prone countries, not majority Muslim countries. You hear that a lot in the media. You know, that's a little bit of that media spin, majority Muslim countries. But we'll go with terror-prone countries. Those countries will still be in there, but obviously the green card holders and folks that are traveling into the United States at the time would be exempt.
I've been saying, the biggest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia. There's no discussion of Indonesia having any ban. And I don't believe Pakistan is in there either, and that's a big Muslim country. So in any event, David, one last thing. These protests, usually it looks like they're paid demonstrators. Are any of them legit, do you think?
Well, I think some of it's legit for sure. Having said that, a lot of it is being put together by liberal activists, no doubt, here in D.C. in other words. Look, there is a Trump war room right now in the Democratic National Committee that is active, very much so, in circles here in Washington and then beyond. And so there's actual proof. We know that liberal activists are behind a lot of this, but the question is, what's the percentage? Look, 70%, 60%, who knows? Here's the bigger problem for Republicans. Until they get a tax reform and a health care plan in place, and until they get a budget moving and legislation moving on Capitol Hill, what are they left with, Pat, at town halls? They don't have anything yet. And I think that's the bigger issue for the Trump administration, for Republicans. They can blame liberal activists. That's fine. But the truth of the matter is they need more proof in the pudding. And when they get that, then they'll at least have some sort of legislative leg to stand on.
David, I agree totally. Thank you so much. David Brody, ladies and gentlemen.